Alright, ladies and gentlemen, MrCropper here. Please go throw me a few bucks on Patreon if you appreciate this work. Link below, link to the text below as well. We're continuing. He was just saying that he doesn't have to seek far for the sum total of cognition. It's inside of his mind. And so now he's going to use logic and the simple operations of reason, which are just given to him, to answer the question of how far reason can go without the material presented by experience. So how far can reason go once we leave experience behind? Quote, so much for the completeness and thoroughness necessary in the execution of the present task. So that is his explanation of how he will be complete and thorough, is by just using logic and reason inside of his own mind. The aims set before us are not arbitrarily proposed, but are imposed upon us by the nature of cognition itself. Alright, so he's diving into his own mind to find out the nature of cognition. The above remarks relate to the matter of our critical inquiry. As regards the form, there are two indispensable conditions which anyone who undertakes so difficult a task as that of a critique of pure reason is bound to fulfill. These conditions are certitude and clearness. So being certain and being clear, alright? He's a lot like an anarchist. He's going to be clear. As regards certitude, I have fully convinced myself that in this sphere of thought, opinion is perfectly inadmissible, and that everything which bears the least semblance of an hypothesis must be excluded as of no value in such discussions. So when we call something certain, we have to exclude opinions and hypotheses. Okay, for it is a necessary condition of every cognition that is to be established upon a priori grounds that it shall be held to be absolutely necessary. Alright, whatever he means by that sentence, let's just stop and say that a priori grounds means before the senses. And the only thing in your mind before the senses is what you had in your mind before you were born. And Aristotle says it's tabula rasa, a blank slate. So, whatever he means by a priori, he must mean something non-Aristotelian. So he's already off in the deep end. Let's just do that sentence again. For it is a necessary condition of every cognition, every operation inside your mind, that is to be established upon a priori grounds, that it shall be held to be absolutely necessary. Alright, so if he can find something inside your mind that was there before sensory perception, then that thing is neither an opinion nor a hypothesis, and is therefore necessary, and probably certain, right? Much more is this the case with an attempt to determine all pure a priori cognition, and to furnish the standard, and consequently an example, of all apodeictic philosophical certitude. Full stop. Now, some people have accused Immanuel Kant of word salading a bit. We wouldn't accuse him of that, would we? Okay. For it isn't we're going to go back, because did you get what's going on there? I didn't, so we're going to go back. Okay? Until we can dismiss it as nonsense, we go back. For it is a necessary condition of every cognition that is to be established upon a priori grounds that it shall be held to be absolutely necessary. So if we find something in the mind that's before senses, then it's a necessary thing. Much more is this the case with an attempt to determine all pure a priori cognition, and to furnish the standard of all philosophical certitude. Much more is what the case? Okay, for it is a necessary condition of every cognition that is to be established upon a priori grounds to be held necessary. Oh, So these other things we're also going to find to be absolutely necessary if they are also established in a way before a priori, or as a priori, before senses. These other things will also be necessary in the same way. Much more is the case, even more so, with an attempt to determine all a priori cognition. So if we find cognition before the senses, not just a thought, but cognition before the senses, then that will also be a necessary thing. In other words, we can be certain of it. So we can be certain of cognition that happens before the senses, if we find it. Okay. And something about an example of apodeictic philosophical certitude. Okay? Now, the thoughts all there are a bit of a mess because there is no such thing as something being necessary. There's no such thing as something being a priori. There's no such thing as cognition outside of sense perception. And so he's got that right there. There are three ideas in that sentence that don't exist in the real world and don't refer to anything in the real world. Okay? A priori, absolutely necessary, and non-sensory cognition. Cognition without sense perception. Those three things are nonsense, okay? He's put them together into a sentence. And he says in that sentence, it's a necessary condition of every cognition, every operation in your mind, that is to be established before senses, that it shall be held absolutely necessary. So anything that happens in your mind in this nonsense way is also that nonsense way. Both these nonsenses occur in your mind with everything that happens in your mind. Two pieces of nonsense occur. A priori and absoluteness of thatness. Thatness has absoluteness, it's necessary, and it's a priori if something that happens in your mind is a necessary condition of every cognition. For everything that happens in your mind that's necessary, there is a priori grounds for it, and it's absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary. And this is even more the case with a priori cognition, not just things in your mind, but actual workings of the mind. And this applies in some way to philosophical certainty. How does it apply to philosophical certainty? To furnish the standard and an example of all philosophical certainty, and to furnish the standard. Much more is the case with an attempt to determine, if we want to establish a standard of philosophical certainty, then we have to be up to all this stuff with these floating abstractions. If we want to be philosophically certain, then we have to meet whatever he said in this sentence with these three floating abstractions, which who knows what the hell he means, okay? Because he said himself he's not connecting them to the senses, so don't try to concretize what he's saying, okay? He himself said these are not connected to the senses, so don't worry about it. So you can try if you want to, but as I've just shown, those aren't connected to the senses, and he said that he's not trying to. He said he's left the senses behind, he's not worried about it. He's seeing how far logic can take him in pure reason alone. Now, has this plane crashed yet? All right, let us continue. Whether I have succeeded in what I have professed to do is for the reader to determine. Ta-da! He is trolling us across 200 years. He's teasing us. He's saying, if you can see through this garbage, congratulations. And he's snickering with us. In fact, I think he's sitting here with the objectivists laughing. I think that Immanuel Kant is the best example of Ellsworth Toohey in the history of mankind. Sitting here with the objectivists, having a bit of a snicker, at people who can't see through this transparent nonsense. Wow. Troll of the century. Okay, whether I have succeeded in what I profess to do is for the reader to determine. It is the author's business merely to adduce grounds and reasons, without determining what influence these ought to have on the mind of his judges. Now, the first bit of that sentence was much more honest than the last bit. The last bit, he's saying, I'm just trying to be objective. You guys judge for yourself whether I've been objective. I'm just trying to be objective. Right after he declares at the beginning that whether I've succeeded is for you to judge. Snicker, snicker. I'm just trying to be objective. Hoity-toity. Smug, smug, smug Kant. Nihilist, nihilist. Hateful, destructive nihilist. And look at that sentence right there. Thumbing his nose at people while telling them that if they accept his nonsense, they are paragons of reason and objectivity. And people who don't accept his nonsense are some other thing. Smug Kant, you're very smug. He's a troll. He's a troll. Alright, continuing. But, lest anything he may have said may become the innocent cause of doubt in their minds, or tend to weaken the effect which his argument might otherwise produce, he may be allowed to point out those passages which may occasion mistrust or difficulty, although these do not concern the main purpose of the present work. So you might find a problem here and there, don't worry about that. It's the main goal that we're talking about. He does not solely with the view of removing from the mind of the reader any doubts which might affect his judgment of the work as a whole, and regard to its ultimatum aim. That is the old trick of this style of German writing. Aim is what that whole sentence is doing, and you've got to keep everything balanced in your head until you find the operative word. And the operative word, is not in the middle or the beginning or somewhere where you can tell what operation is going on. You have to keep all these concretes floating in your head without knowing what is happening with them until the very last word of the sentence. So, its ultimate aim. That's what we're talking about here, the word aim. Here's the sentence again. He does this solely. Now, I guess he is the reader. Let's go back to the sentence above. Whether I have succeeded in doing what I profess to do is for the reader to determine. It's the author's business merely to adduce the grounds and reasons without determining the influence. But lest anything he may have said, the author may have said, have become innocent cause of doubt in their mind, or tend to weaken the effect which the author's arguments might otherwise produce, the author may be allowed to point out those passages which may occasion mistrust or difficulty, although these do not concern the main purpose of the present work. So he himself will point those out. He, I guess the author still, does this solely with the view of removing from the mind of the reader any doubts which might affect his judgment. Is that the reader's judgment of the work as a whole? So he says he, and then he says his. And it must mean the reader's judgment. He starts off saying the writer does this solely with the view of removing from the mind of the reader any doubts which might affect the reader's judgment of the work as a whole, and in regard to its ultimate aim. Now, either the person who translated that did not know what they were doing, because he uses he and his in the sentence where he refers to the writer and his refers to the reader. So either the person who wrote that sentence, the person who wrote that sentence wasn't clear in its meaning, which is very possibly the case, or the person who translated that sentence had no frickin' clue what was going on. But either way, they use he and his to refer to two different subjects in that sentence, and that sentence is therefore not grammatical. We could try to wring some meaning out of it. Kant is saying that he's pointing these things out in order to clarify for the reader. So even when he points out difficulties in his philosophy, that doesn't dismiss the whole. He's just trying to make things super, super clear. Okay, he says there are some things, there are some bumps that may occasion mistrust or difficulty, although it doesn't affect the judgment of the work as a whole and the ultimate aim of the work. Okay. Whew! Well, Immanuel Kant, you succeeded in confusing the translator who tried to get your information to us. I wonder if Kant himself was clear. I don't read German well enough to read the original German. If any of you know German, please go do that sentence for us and help us out there and find out what was going on. Was the translator wrong, or was Kant word salady? Okay, I know no investigations more necessary for a full insight into the nature of the faculty which we call understanding, and at the same time for the determination of the rules and limits of its use, than those undertaken in the second chapter of the Transcendental Analytic, under the title of the deduction of pure conceptions of the understanding. So he says, in my work I do something very, very important. I know of no other place anything so important's been done. And they have also cost me by far the greatest labor which I hope will not remain uncompensated. The view there taken, which goes somewhat deeply into the subject, has two sides. Alright, we're about to delve into the subject of this very, very important, highly laborious, very difficult to erect structure that he's done, which has no relation to the five senses or empirical data, may we remind you. Okay. Here are the two sides. The one side relates to the objects of the pure understanding, and is intended to demonstrate and to render comprehensible the objective validity of its a priori conceptions. Okay, so one relates to the objects of pure understanding, and we want to be able to understand the objective validity of before the senses ideas. Okay, so he wants to understand how ideas that come before the senses are objectively valid. That is pure understanding. How is it that objectively valid ideas can come before the senses? How is it that conceptions before the senses are objectively valid? Okay, that's what pure understanding means. Now, of course, there is nothing before the senses, and there's no understanding anything outside of the senses. So, of course, it's not valid. But that's one side of his false coin, okay? The other considers the pure understanding itself. So if that wasn't clear enough, let's delve into the unclearness. The understanding itself, its possibility, and its powers of cognition. So what are all of the interesting and wonderful things you can do now that you've left the senses behind and you're simply understanding ideas and the valid nature of ideas? How would you validate the nature of them? Before the senses. And that is pure understanding itself of cognition. That is from a subjective point of view. Okay, whatever you mean by subjective. So when you're dancing in La La Land like that and you say, well, I mean subjective. Well, didn't you say above the objective validity of a priori conceptions? From a subjective point of view. The objective validity of a priori conceptions from a subjective point of view. Okay. And although this exposition is of great importance, it does not belong essentially to the main purpose of the work, because the grand question is what and how much reason and understanding, apart from experience, cognize, and not how is the faculty of thought itself possible. So he's not asking how is thought possible. He's asking what can reason cognize apart from experience? What and how much can reason and understanding cognize apart from experience? That's his question. What and how much can reason and understanding cognize apart from experience? Okay? My answer is 0, Immanuel Kant. 0. Okay? As the latter is an inquiry into the cause of a given effect, and has thus in it some semblance of a hypothesis, although as I shall now remember, you can't do a hypothesis. That's a no-no, because that's not necessary. It's not a thing that is necessary. If a thing is necessary, then it's a priori and objectively true. Hypotheses and opinions don't count. So he's worried that one of his things that he says is a priori seems like it might resemble a hypothesis. Now, that's going to worry him. Of course, this wouldn't worry an objectivist. We would look at that and say, well, you're just connecting a bunch of nonsense in thin air. Why are you even worrying about connections between things that have no connection to reality? You're not making any relation between anything real there. Why are you trying to connect two ideas that aren't connected to reality? Quit being an idiot. But he's worried about that. He thinks that one of his pure categories or necessary items that has come to him a priori might resemble a hypothesis, which would mean that it's not necessary. So now he's got to investigate that little quirk. He says there is some semblance of a hypothesis, although, as I shall show on another occasion, this is really not the fact. So let's not worry about that right now, the fact that there seems to be something that I'm treating as necessary, which also seems to be a hypothesis. We're going to get to that later. It would seem that in the present instance, I had allowed myself to enounce a mere opinion. So it might seem like I'm dealing with things that aren't actually necessary, and that the reader must therefore be at liberty to hold a different opinion. So you think that you can have a different idea, but I beg to remind him that if my subjective deduction does not produce in his mind the conviction of its certitude at which I am aimed, the objective deduction with which alone the present work is properly concerned is in every respect satisfactory. So even if my subjective deduction does not, in his mind, the conviction of its certitude, does not produce in his mind the conviction of its certitude at which I aimed, still, whatever I did in my philosophical work stands. So I guess he's saying if the reader is not convinced, it just means that I wasn't able to reproduce in the reader's mind what I'm trying to say. It doesn't mean that what I'm trying to say doesn't stand. I beg to remind him that if my subjective deduction does not produce in his mind the conviction of its certitude at which I am aimed, so just because he isn't convinced of the truth of what I'm saying, nevertheless, the objective deduction, what I have deduced about reality in an objective and verifiable sense, but not verifiable, remember, it's not connected to the senses, but it's objective because he used reason, right? The objective deduction with which alone the present work is concerned is in every respect satisfactory. So, doesn't matter if the reader agrees or not, even if the reader disagrees, still, what I have accomplished in this work is satisfactory. Very nice sentence, Kant. Very nice sentence. He doesn't smirk explicitly in that sentence, does he, like he did in the earlier ones? But I think he is a bit. Alright, well, the next paragraph is going to be a doozy because it's longer than the one we just finished. So let's end that video there, 24 minutes. If you appreciate what I'm doing, please patronize me. We'll be doing Victor Pross in a few days, argument with him, a debate with him. We'll be talking to anarchists. Might be traveling for debates if I can get enough Patreon support. And we'll be doing discussions. And as you can see, we'll be doing Immanuel Kant. That son of a bitch is trolling us across 250 years. Holy crap.